In June of 1950, the Korean War began with a sudden surprise attack. North Korea attacked South Korea. North Korea had very few resources, but it was backed by both the Soviet Union and Communist China, which gave North Korea a huge source of military support. South Korea was almost immediately taken over. The goal was North Korea wanted to enslave South Korea under the same communist dictatorship that had the northern half of the country. South Korea almost entirely disappeared. Quickly, however, the United Nations came to the rescue, and it's important to note it was the United Nations, not the United States. It was an international coalition of countries including France, Greece, Ethiopia, Netherlands, Turkey, South Africa, Belgium, Colombia, Canada, England, and many more. So the Korean War began. Since World War II ended in 1945, America has been in two major wars, the Korean War and the Vietnam War. So since 1945, leading up to the present, two major wars, Korea and Vietnam. There have been quite a number of very small conflicts, not even really worth being called wars. We've been involved with in the Middle East, Iraq, Afghanistan, a few other places, South America, Yugoslavia, but major wars, actual full-scale wars, only two since 1945, Korea and Vietnam. We're going to look at Korea right now, and it has to do with the ending of World War II. When World War II ended in 1945, Korea had been occupied by the Japanese. The Japanese were brutal dictators, harsh. They tortured people, they killed people, they raped people, they enslaved people. Koreans were treated horribly under the Japanese. Good news for the Koreans is in 1945, the Japanese pack up and go home because they lost the war. Korea is no longer under Japanese domination. But what's going to happen to Korea? Well, the winning forces in World War II were the United States and the Soviet Union, and those two are going to divide Korea into two parts, North Korea and South Korea. So that's how we get to where we are today, the fact that there are two Koreas. Same thing was happening at the same time to Germany. East Germany and West Germany were created at the end of World War II. So South Korea is under the protection of the United States, and the United States is there to make sure that it sets up its own government and is able to run itself and not be hassled by the Japanese. The Soviet Union is supposed to do the same for North Korea. They're supposed to protect it, supposed to make sure it can set up its own independent government, but instead the Soviet Union does not protect North Korea, it takes over North Korea. It installs a puppet dictator. The Soviet Union finds a family, the last name is Kim, and you will recognize Kim Jong-un as the present one, but there was Kim Il-sung, and there were a whole series of dictators, 3 generations, the grandfather, the father, and the current one. They were native North Koreans, but they were working for the Soviets, imposing Soviet rule over North Korea. So we have the U.S. protecting the South, and the Soviet Union, instead of protecting the North, is dictating the North, is controlling the North. And so it goes from 1945 until 1950. These two Koreas side by side with this line in the middle. Suddenly in mid-1950, a surprise attack. The North will attack the South. June 1950, the Korean War begins. Because it was a surprise attack and they were effective at keeping it a surprise, nobody saw it coming, they were able to completely overwhelm the South. There were only 2 very small parts of South Korea that the North didn't capture at first. There's a little area down here, an area called Pusan. You'll hear that name in history books. And then a little area around Incheon and Seoul that was hanging on by a thread. So South Korea was almost completely devastated by the North, and if nobody did anything in a couple of months, that would have been the end of South Korea entirely. The North would have taken it all. But the United Nations comes to the rescue, and here's where it's important to say United Nations. It's not the United States that's involved. It is the United Nations, which means we have Canada, France, England. We have people from Italy and Spain and Mexico. It is a multinational force which is opposing North Korea. Now, when we say that, we also have to say that the most powerful of those forces was from the United States, but the forces from the other nations were significant too. Eventually, those forces will come in and push the North Koreans back to their starting line and then push further still. And the war is going to go from the South being almost entirely destroyed by the North. It's going to flip. The South is going to push all the way up to the very edge of the North, and almost all of North Korea is going to be occupied by the South. The Korean War was the first war in which jet aircraft did the majority of the fighting. There were some propeller-driven aircraft, but they were not many. On both sides, jet aircraft did the main work. The F-84 Thunderjet is shown here, one of the American aircraft. The major American aircraft, or the premier American aircraft, was the F-86 Sabre, the most powerful, most technologically advanced aircraft of the war. The P-80 Shooting Star was America's first jet aircraft deployed in the Korean War. On the North Korean side, the Soviet Union had given the North Koreans an airplane called the MiG-15, hundreds of them. At the beginning of the war, the MiG-15 was considered to be very advanced, but the American technology caught up and eventually surpassed the MiG-15. So the MiG-15 was outdated by the end of the war. Commanding in South Korea on the United Nations side was General Douglas MacArthur, commanding not only the United States, but rather also the United Nations, so in charge of soldiers from Greece, France, Ethiopia, Turkey, Belgium, Canada, England, etc., etc. General MacArthur reported to his boss, President Harry S. Truman. Truman was not particularly happy with Douglas MacArthur. MacArthur had a number of things that irritated Truman. First of all, MacArthur wanted to use nuclear weapons and wanted to do so without the authorization or permission of President Truman. Secondly, MacArthur wanted to expand the war from being a war against North Korea to being a war against China. Truman did not want to expand the war. Finally, Douglas MacArthur had been communicating privately with congressmen, and that's a violation of protocol because a military general is supposed to communicate to his boss, the President of the United States, and not be talking to congressmen. President Truman was irritated at Douglas MacArthur for these reasons, and he fired MacArthur. So MacArthur is no longer Commander-in-Chief of the United Nations forces in South Korea. Harry S. Truman finishes his time as president and is replaced by Dwight Eisenhower. Eisenhower, upon becoming president in early 1953, quickly negotiates an end to the Korean War. They write an armistice, a truce, a ceasefire. The military conflict on the Korean peninsula stops. The war itself technically did not end. They simply stopped the shooting. And the war could have ended there with a South Korean victory, but there were a couple of things that got in the way. First of all, there were concerns about China. China was not directly involved in the war. It was selling supplies to North Korea, helping them with some machine guns and tanks and airplanes and so forth. The Soviet Union was also supplying the North with equipment, but neither China nor the Soviet Union was directly involved, and the United Nations wanted to keep it that way. They were afraid that if they pushed too hard, China and the Soviet Union would get involved and we would have another world war. And so we wanted to avoid having an all-out world war, including China and the Soviet Union. So the United Nations stopped short of completely taking over the North. They could have done it, could have easily done it, but they stopped short of doing that. Another concern, of course, was that this was the first war to be fought during the atomic age, meaning that both the United States and the Soviet Union had atomic weapons, and nobody wanted to see them used. So they were afraid that if they pushed too hard, somebody would get nervous and push their finger on the button that would set atomic weapons into motion. So the UN forces, the United States, together with the other United Nations, stopped short of taking over the North, and they called a truce, and they sent people to go negotiate. And there was a lot of negotiations. They sat around and talked and talked and talked, and finally wrote up an agreement. And what they did is they drew the line very close to where it used to be. Here's where it was at the beginning of the war. Here's where it was at the end of the war. And so the UN, the United Nations, and the United States gave this land back. We had enough military power to keep it, but we were trying to be nice guys, so we gave the land back to them. And North Korea got to keep almost exactly its border from before the war. The war, however, never officially ended. This was a ceasefire. This was a temporary truce, but it was not a peace treaty. And in fact, no peace treaty has been signed, and so technically this war has been going for over 70 years. Now, the actual fighting has stopped long time ago, right? The actual fighting stopped over 60 years ago, but the condition of Korea right now to this day is it's a temporary ceasefire, a temporary truce. They haven't drawn a peace agreement. Okay, so where do we end up? We end up kind of where we started, really. Not much difference. North Korea is still ruled by brutal dictatorships. South Korea is still has its own independent government, and the United States and the United Nations are trying to help South Korea keep its independence, keep its freedom, keep its ability to vote and have freely elected representative government. North Korea continues. The Soviet Union no longer exists, of course, so it doesn't have the same level of support that it had in the 1950s from China or from the Soviet Union. It still gets some support from China, which is why currently North Korea has a lot of economic problems because it lacks that big Soviet Union style support that it used to get. But the war technically never ended. It's a temporary ceasefire. And that's why, to this very day, politicians all around the world are worried about Korea. The Korean War was a hard-fought and bloody conflict. The number of American soldiers who died is somewhere between 36,000 and 50,000, and many soldiers from other countries also died. It was a difficult and painful conflict, and yet in history it's often forgotten. It has become known as the Forgotten War. Between World War II and Vietnam lies Korea, and it's a middle point in the development of the 20th century.